thank you. It's true that I literally just flew in, and I can't help but think of Henny Youngman's line, which is, I just flew in and boy are my arms tired. I have to say, having listened to the panels, a lot of the terminology is very similar. I mean, when I teach at Georgetown, and when I teach a class on Middle East, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but I also teach a class on statecraft and diplomacy. And I have a block within that class on the attributes of being a good negotiator or mediator. Well, the most important attribute for a negotiator or mediator, be a good listener. You don't learn when you're talking. You learn when you're listening. Be an active listener, because you want to draw out. You want to show a kind of curiosity as well. I would assume, from the standpoint of being a doctor, showing kind of curiosity also is a way to create a bond with a patient. So there are some similarities. I would also say another similarity, although, Jeffrey, you said that the outcomes might be, good to not so bad. I would say in the foreign policy area, frequently they're bad to really terrible, and you have to figure out how you do the least bad. So here I am, it's June 6th, and it's literally, this is the 50th anniversary of the 1967 war. So it's kind of hard for me to come here and not talk about that just because I'm thinking about it. And what I'd like to do in the time I have is talk a little bit about the backdrop to the 1967 war. Since you said say something personal, I want to say something personal in light of that. And then look at both the aftermath, what the region looked like in 1967, and what it looks like today, so that you get some means of comparison, and I'll try not to completely depress you in the process. I have to say I tend to go to my synagogue every Saturday morning, and most of the other congregants will come up to me and ask me to give them some good news. So usually I say, as long as you don't require me to talk about the Middle East, I can probably do that. So let's go 1967, 1967 war. I was a freshman in college. And for me, it was a transforming event. Like many people in 1967, in June of 1967, who were in college, Vietnam was all-consuming. It took up all the oxygen. And in my case, it created a very strong interest in foreign policy. But the June War, the Six-Day War, for me, had a huge impact in a couple of respects. First, I had been a critic. When you're a freshman in college, you're a critic of everything, right? You challenge everything. I was opposed to the Vietnam War, but not because I was a pacifist. I was opposed to it because I thought it was the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that basically it was diverting American preoccupation and resources and attention from what it needed to be, and along comes the Six-Day War. And here I see America has interest in the Middle East, but I don't see the interest in Southeast Asia. And so the war sort of validated my sense that we were wrong in terms of what we were doing, but it also suddenly triggered an interest in the Middle East. Before the war, I didn't have that interest. Before the war, I was focused on American foreign policy, clearly driven by Vietnam, but also a kind of concern with the Soviet Union. This war suddenly made me interested in the Middle East, and from that point on, I've obviously retained that interest. It did something else. I would say it really catalyzed my Jewish identity. Now, that was not an unusual experience, I think, for a lot of American Jews, and probably for many of my age group, and particularly at that time, when there was a kind of emergence of trying to create a sense of identity. And you saw it with African Americans at that time, you saw it with Asian Americans, you saw it with Hispanics and so forth. So it wasn't unusual for this to be a kind of catalyzing event in terms of creating a stronger sense of identity in many younger American Jews, and I was certainly one of them. The war itself, if you look at the 67, On the Arab side, 67 was about avenging Palestine. You have to go back to 1948. 1948, during Israel's War of Independence, when Israel declares itself, all of its Arab neighbors invaded. Now, obviously, there had been a war with the Arabs in Palestine prior to the declaration of the state. But now you have all the neighbors who come in. Now, at the outcome of that war, with the fact that Israel wins, and actually the territory it has after that war is larger than the partition plan had called for. And there's a kind of, there's a deep sense of betrayal throughout the Arab world, and most of the leaderships that were in power were swept out over the next 4 to 5 years. And they were replaced by actually a different class coming from the countryside, from rural areas. Many, if not most, coming from, were really junior military officers. And these junior military officers come to dominate authoritarian regimes, and they create a kind of legitimizing symbol. And what's the legitimizing symbol? They're going to avenge Palestine. The most prominent figure who emerges is obviously Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. He becomes catapulted into a kind of unusual stature because of the 1956 war. The 1956 war involves Israel in quiet coordination with the British and the French, and Israel is quickly able to take back the Sinai from the Egyptians, and yet, because of American opposition, America forces the British and the French, who had worked out a plan where they were going to come in ostensibly to separate the combatants to protect the Suez Canal. And of course, Israel gets to the Suez Canal much more quickly than they're even able to intervene, so it's obvious that this is kind of a charade that they're engaged in. But they do end up introducing forces. President Eisenhower is dead set against all this, and he imposes enormous pressure. I mean, at that time, the United States is actually one of the main providers of oil to both the British and the French. We basically put a hold on the supply of oil. We actually postponed and actually put a hold on a billion pound sterling loan to the British. And we literally forced them to withdraw. And the United States puts enormous pressure on Israel to withdraw as well. I mean, threatening not just sanctions, but actually expulsion from the UN. I mean, it was very tough stuff. In the end, Eisenhower does make a couple of commitments when Ben-Gurion does withdraw from the Sinai. The commitments are that we will recognize that if the Straits of Tiran are blockaded again, that Israel will have the right of self-defense and would, in a sense, have the right to act on its own to ensure the blockade is ended, but that the U.S., recognizing this as an international waterway, would take the lead in ensuring that the blockade is prevented. So Nasser basically accepts that he's taking plaudits for having won. He also accepts the introduction of United Nations forces, the UNEF it's called, the United Nations Emergency Forces, into the Sinai, who separate basically the Egyptians and the Israelis. And for the most part, the Egyptians stay out. If there is a kind of unification of the Arabs and they become one state, not only will they be able to avenge the loss of Palestine, but they will become this great power on the world stage. The only problem is that there isn't any other Arab leader who basically wants to submit to Nasser. And so what you find is over the period of time up to 67, Nasser has a high point after 56. It goes up a little higher when Syria seeks to join with Egypt and they create the United Arab Republic. And then he starts a losing streak because there's a coup in Syria and they pull out of the Union in 61. Then he goes into war in Yemen. He is basically at the throats of every other Arab leader, whether it's the monarchies like in Saudi Arabia or in Jordan, or it's the radical Arab nationalists, Ba'athis in Syria and Iraq. They're all at his throat. By May of 67, he's looking for a win. So suddenly he after the Soviets say the Israelis are massing forces on the Golan Heights, which they're not, it's a completely false claim, Nasser decides that what he'll do is he will send his forces back into the Sinai, and he will tell the UN they should leave. And lo and behold, the Secretary General of UN, U Thant, goes along with it. Now, Nasser then, after a couple of days, after he sends 6 divisions to Israel's border, and he declares that the Straits of Tiran have been mined, now he goes to his parliament, he declares on May 29th, we have reversed the results of 1956, now we're going to reverse the results of 1948. In other words, he's going to avenge Palestine, but he's not alone. The next day, King Hussein, who he has called the dwarf king, they have had a war of words between them, suddenly shows up in Cairo, puts all of his forces under Egyptian command. The president of Iraq declares that Israel will be wiped off the map, and all the Arab armies will meet in Tel Aviv. This is the imagery. There's a frenzy in the Arab world that is building, and Nasser has restored his sense of being a hero. In Israel at this time, you have people who are not, those who are not mobilized, are digging ditches around cities and preparing cemeteries for mass fatalities. There is an image this is going to be an existential conflict. Now, the Israeli military is much more confident about this, but I give you all this background because the expectation is that this is a war for survival, and there's no real preparation for what's going to come after this war. Now, one of the great ironies is, of course, Israel wins the war very quickly. This is a 6-day war after all. It destroys in the first 3 hours of the war with a preemptive strike the Egyptian Air Force. And when it acts, even though it seeks to persuade the Jordanians not to enter, Hussein comes into the war. Israel is able to destroy the Jordanian and the Syrian Air Forces in another 3 hours. So here is a colossal victory, but there's no real plan for what comes after it. One little interesting historical footnote is that on June 19th, 1967, the Israeli cabinet adopts a secret resolution that would provide for, if Israel gets peace, returning to the international borders with Egypt and with Syria. 3 months later, there's an Arab summit. Nasser announces his 3 no's: no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiations with Israel, no to peace with Israel. And this resolution that was adopted on June 19th quietly is rescinded as well. Now, you note, when I said the resolution referred to the international border as it related to Egypt and to Syria, I didn't say anything about Jordan. And here there's uncertainty, there's a discussion. What do you do now? And it's too soon to put it into any kind of resolution. The head of the research branch of military intelligence writes a memo immediately after the war and suggests, look, we don't want to occupy 1 million Arabs. We should actually create a demilitarized Palestinian state there. Dayan is the Minister of Defense. He becomes the Minister of Defense on June 1, because while I describe the digging of ditches around cities, the preparation of cemeteries, Eshkol, because he doesn't want to recreate the problems with the United States that existed in 1956, he goes to great lengths to try to see if the United States will act to fulfill the commitments that they made in 1956 and 57. In fact, we don't, notwithstanding the fact that Lyndon Johnson is maybe emotionally the most attached to Israel of all American presidents, from Truman to Obama, but he's completely hamstrung by Vietnam, and he faces a Congress that isn't prepared to support anything he would do. He wants to organize a flotilla to open the Straits of Tiran. He can't get any support for it. So Eshkol, during this 3-week period, looks increasingly weak, looks increasingly uncertain to the Israeli public, and he's forced on June 1 to bring in Dayan to be Minister of Defense. Dayan, in response to this memo, says, no, I don't want to go that way. I want to create a ministerial committee and we'll look at the options. And there's actually a little bit of a struggle with Eshkol about who should actually chair this committee. In the end, Eshkol defers to Dayan, and the issue, in a sense, is deferred. So for many, one of the reasons I give you the backdrop before I begin to describe the difference between the region then and now is there's been a lot of historical revisionism that has emerged. That is also part of, I think, a narrative of always trying to suggest a kind of conspiracy about Israel. That, oh, Israel laid a trap for Nasser and he walked into it. No, Israel didn't create this trap. No, Israel didn't plan this war. No, Israel didn't plan the aftermath of this war. And even now, we're still living with, obviously, some of the legacies from that war. So look at the region then and compare it to now. All right, so the region then. Did they have proxy wars then? Yeah, they did. There was a war in Yemen at this time. Nasser actually had put 70,000 of his forces between 62 and 67 into Yemen. And Nasser used poison gas in Yemen during this time. That sounds a little similar to what we see today. It was a proxy war between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So that's one quasi-similarity. Another similarity is that there was a religious divide, but it wasn't a divide between sort of radical Islamists and non-Islamists. It was a divide between those who claimed to embody religion and those who were secular. The Saudis created something called the Islamic Summit, the Islamic Pact, as a way of competing with Nasser. Nasser was a radical secular nationalist. The Baathists in Syria and Iraq were radical secular nationalists. The Saudis sought to create what was a kind of Islamic alternative to them as a way of creating more of a legitimate base for competing with them. Now, that is different from what we see today, because what we see today is, in fact, a kind of struggle between radical Islamists and non-Islamists. It's not so much secular forces who are competing. It is a kind of overlay which has created a sectarian conflict. I mean, you can look at the proxy wars that we see today in Syria and in Yemen, and they're basically between a Saudi-led group and the Iranians and the Iranian use of Shia militias. Now, you could say that's Arab-Persian, but it really has a Sunni-Shia quality to it. Doesn't mean that's the only conflict, because when you're fighting ISIS, that's radical Sunni as well. Sunnis can be fighting Sunnis, but there's no question that if you look at the broad struggle in the region right now, it's Iran's use of Shia militias throughout the region that is now producing, you see, a response everywhere. Something else that separates the proxy conflicts of today with the proxy conflict back in the 60s. Today, the proxy conflict is a conflict that doesn't stay in the region. I mean, think about, we have a saying in the United States. I mean, it's part of you were talking about advertising campaigns for pharmaceuticals. Well, the Las Vegas advertising, Las Vegas rules. The Las Vegas rules means what takes place in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Well, the Las Vegas rules don't apply to the Middle East. What takes place in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. All you have to do is look at the war in Syria and the impact it's had on Europe because of the flow of refugees. We look at the region today, and I would say, Carl, apropos of what in my book, having gone through every administration from Truman to Obama, looking at what every administration faced and what key assumptions drove it, every administration faced a war or a major Middle East crisis, sometimes both. And yet, notwithstanding the fact that every administration from Truman to Obama faced that, what this administration faces is more daunting. Because, first of all, something that separates the region today from the late 60s, you have the state system itself under attack. Syria is probably never going to be put back together again. Maybe it won't be formal, but you'll probably end up with a de facto partition. Iraq will probably retain itself as a country, but it'll be decentralized. Yemen probably won't survive as a country. Libya, probably the same. The state system is under a threat in a way it wasn't in the past. In addition to that, look at the war in Syria. It's not a war. It's at least two wars. There's a war against ISIS, and then there's a war against Assad. And you can't really have a strategy against ISIS if you don't have a strategy against Assad. One manifestation of that, you've already seen the Trump administration bomb a base because chemical weapons were used, and then 2 weeks ago, bomb a convoy that was headed towards what was an area along the Syrian-Jordanian border where the US and the British have established a kind of special operations base. And this particular area was supposed to be an area that was part of an understanding with the Russians that would be off limits. And yet, here was a force, actually, it wasn't Syrian, it was Shia militias, that sent a convoy, ignored all the warnings, and so we had to bomb them. So the idea that you can only have a strategy for ISIS and not for Syria, I think, is an illusion. But the strategy you face in each is enormously complicated, and actually much more complicated than anything we've seen before. I'll give you one example. Take a look at the effort to try to liberate Raqqa. The US now, the administration has made a decision to arm the Syrian Protection Forces, also known as the YPG. But the YPG has, as you might imagine, terrible relations with the Turks because the Turks look at the YPG, I'm giving you alphabet soup, but the PKK, who they have fought for years and who is on the American terrorism list. Well, we have to manage the relationship there, and we also have to manage the reality that the YPG actually has good relations with the Assad regime, good relations with the Russians, good relations with the Iranians. Now, what happens if they, because we've armed them, because they've been the most effective fighters for us against ISIS, what happens if they invite the regime and the Shia militias in to Raqqa in the aftermath? Every time the Shia militias have liberated a certain area or fought in a certain area, all the young Sunni males have disappeared. So if we don't have a plan for what comes afterwards in terms of who's actually going to be running Raqqa, and it ends up being the regime with Shia militias, you're very likely going to recreate the conditions that produced ISIS in the first place. So the Trump administration has to fully recognize that. It has to recognize something beyond that. Even if you can bring others in who are Sunnis, because this is a Sunni area, one of the things that's going to have happen is you have to have a plan you can actually implement. And the plan you're actually going to have to implement is one that has to produce reconstruction, security, governance, and inclusion. All of that is daunting, to say the least. If that were the only problem in Syria, it would be huge, and it's not. If that were the only problem in the Middle East, it would be, as we say during Pesach, Dayenu, right? It would be enough, but it's not, because you have the same challenge in Iraq. Mosul will be, the struggle for Mosul has gone on for over 6 months. The casualties are terrible. The destruction is terrible. And the need for reconstruction in the aftermath, the need for security, the need for governance, the need for inclusion. Again, if there isn't a plan that can be implemented, you very much run the risk that you might see son of ISIS somewhere down the road. So I say all of this just to give you a sense of how daunting the problems are. And since I said I don't want to leave you completely depressed, I want to identify two developments that are potential assets if we know how to take advantage of them. The first will probably surprise you. The second may not. The first is that in Saudi Arabia, there is actually a genuine effort to transform the country. Whether it can succeed, I don't know. But there's a genuine effort. The National Transformation Plan is designed not just to expand and change the character of the economy so that it is not simply based on oil, diversify the sources of revenue. It's designed to modernize the country. So you see a series of things that are being done. You see there is going to be an effort to take a part of the Saudi National Oil Company, Aramco, and take it public, create an IPO, initial public offering. Now, that might seem, limited in terms of its impact, but think about the following. Once you take it public, it means it has to be transparent. It means the books have to be opened up. It means it can't be the private piggy bank for the royal family. Well, that's pretty revolutionary. Secondly, the power of the religious police has now been curbed. They can no longer go into malls. They can no longer detain, interrogate, or arrest. And this has proven to be a very popular move, especially among the young in Saudi Arabia, and 70% of the population in Saudi Arabia is under the age of 25. Highest per capita use of Twitter on the planet in Saudi Arabia. They're bringing, when I was there, I met not only the whole leadership, one of the ministers I met 6 ministers, one of the ministers I met was the Minister of Entertainment. I mean, I thought that would be a nice job to have, Minister of Entertainment. Why? Because there's an understanding that Saudis spend an enormous amount of money outside the country because there isn't much to do within the country. So Six Flags, which is an amusement park in the States, is going to Saudi Arabia, and it's going to be co-ed. I went to King Abdullah City in Saudi Arabia, which is on the Red Sea. It's about 90 minutes north of Jeddah. And I went to the College of Entrepreneurship, and I met a co-ed delegation, men and women, equal numbers, completely enthusiastic about how they were going to remake the country. Now, I tell you this as a potential asset, not because I can tell you I'm certain it can succeed. It has a lot to overcome. It has a religious establishment that has a very powerful vested interest in not seeing things change, and maybe parts of the royal family the same. And yet, this is being driven from the inside, not from the outside. And I mention it because there's never been a successful model of modernization or development in the Arab world. And that's one of the reasons you've had this constant stream of pretenders who are going to restore the region. They're going to restore the Middle East, going to restore the Arabs to greatness that was lost. There's a constant stream of those who claim, starting with Nasser, who they will find ways to produce progress and make themselves, make the region, make a culture that was dominant in the 10th century dominant again. Now, whether it's the radical secularists, or it's the Muslim Brotherhood that says Islam is the answer, or it's ISIS, which says the way to perfect things is to turn things back to the 7th century, all of them failed because they have ideologies. And here I'll say ideologies, not mindsets. They have ideologies that, by definition, couldn't succeed. They precluded their success. But having a model of success that could be replicated would be a huge development in this region and could be one of the drivers towards creating a much more basic stability. So it's in our interest to find a way to help make it work. So that's one new development that is also a potential asset. The second one is one that will surprise you less. We now see, even though it's below the radar screen, there is a level of cooperation in practical terms between Israel and the Sunni Arab states and the Sunni Arab leaderships. And this, too, is a new phenomenon. Again, it's below the radar screen because of the Palestinian issue, but it doesn't make it any less real, doesn't make it any less practical, and it's being driven by a shared perception of threats. Now, what's interesting about this, it's not the first time there has been a shared perception of threats. Alexander Haig in 1981, when he was the Secretary of State, said there's a strategic consensus in the region. This is because he said of the threat from Iran, because you'd had the revolution in Iran in 1979, and because of the Soviet threat. Maybe in the laboratory there was a strategic consensus, but there wasn't a strategic consensus in practice. Today, there is non-visible, generally not discussed, but there is a reality of very practical cooperation in counterterror, intelligence, security, and the like. Now, the question is, can that new asset, can it be used to deal not only with some of the threats in the region? For example, it is an asset that could be used against Iran's use of Shia militias. You could certainly develop options to respond to it using this cooperation, using this new asset. And similarly against ISIS. Obviously, it's applied. You see it in places like with what's being done with Egypt and with Jordan as it relates to ISIS types of groups. But it could also be useful on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I mean, this is an issue that I've worked on for 30 years, and I can say I believe it's at as low an ebb as at any point since I've worked on it. Not because the level of violence is the worst, because it's not, but because the level of belief is so low. In fact, it's not belief, it's disbelief on each side. Israelis are convinced the Palestinians are incapable of being any kind of a partner, and Palestinians are convinced that Israelis will never accept a real independent state. And the psychological gap is so great that it's very difficult. President Trump can talk about the ultimate deal, but the ultimate deal isn't going to take place in an atmosphere where there's complete disbelief on the two sides. If you could produce negotiations tomorrow, they wouldn't produce anything because the gaps are so great on the substance and the psychology on each side is so infused with a complete doubt and disbelief about the other. Now, having said that, this new Israeli-Arab cooperation could be a vehicle, and I say it in the following sense. The Palestinians on their own can't make concessions. They see themselves as the weaker party. They see themselves as the victim of great injustice. The compromise itself has never been rationalized as part of their political culture. So to make a concession towards the Israelis is something that is really a non-starter, unless, of course, there's an Arab cover for it. It isn't to say the Arabs assume the responsibility, but at least they provide a kind of cover for the Palestinians. They can justice role. And here there's a bit of an irony. I say a bit of an irony because, you know, the Saudis are focused on modernization on the inside and Iran's threats on the outside. They're not focused on this issue. But, and you saw the way they received President Trump, they are very anxious to ensure the United States will not withdraw from the region. Historically, one of the great misperceptions about all the Arab leaders was that they were preoccupied with Israel above everything else. No, they weren't. They have always been preoccupied with their own security and their survival. That's what they were preoccupied with. They were never going to make their relationship with the United States dependent upon our relationship with Israel because that wasn't related to security and survival. Security and survival they see as being connected intimately to the U.S. being in the region. They perceived, fairly or not, that President Obama was withdrawing from the region and saw the Iranians as part of the solution to the problems in the region, not the source of the problems in the region. So they want us in. And they're not entirely sure, even after this visit, that we will stay in. Because, well, what happens? So ISIS is defeated in Raqqa and in Mosul. And even though I'm focused on what comes next, the concern is maybe, you know, maybe the Trump administration says mission accomplished as soon as they're gone. And when, with the production of shale oil being what it is in the States, maybe it's not so easy for the U.S. to stay in the region. So they want us in the region. If they think that the Trump administration and the president, because he talks about this as the ultimate deal, and he talks about wanting to see it happen, if they think that the way to keep him in the region is to say, okay, we'll work on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, they're doing it not because of the Palestinian issue, they're doing it because of the United States. But that may be what, in fact, creates a certain motivator for them to do this. Now, having said that, I do have to qualify it with the following point. Even if they play the role, they're not going to do it on the cheap. I know there's some people who like to talk about, you know, we'll deal with the Palestinian issue by dealing with the Arabs, as if you don't have to deal with the Palestinians, you'll just deal with the Arabs and they'll take care of it for you. Well, understand the following. When the Arabs come to play this role, which I think is an important thing for them to do, both for the Palestinians and the Israelis, for the reasons I've said, they will need to show that they delivered for the Palestinians what the Palestinians could not deliver for themselves. Meaning they won't accept an outcome where it looks like they didn't fulfill Palestinian national aspirations. Having a Palestinian entity within an Israeli state is not something they'll be prepared to commit to. So they may well play the role, especially if they think it's important to the United States, and it certainly looks like it's important to President Trump. But when they do play that role, they won't do it in a way that, as I said, is really on the cheap. So there is a sense of possibility here. As daunting as everything looks in the region, there is a potential for change. The real challenge will be also, in the end, is the Trump administration capable of fully seeing and understanding these changes, understanding the leverage they have, knowing how to act on them, and knowing how to orchestrate what would be a series of moves in private, where Israel takes some steps, the Palestinians take some steps, and the Arabs take some steps, not to produce the ultimate deal, because that's not available immediately or in the near term, but to break the stalemate and restore a sense of possibility. You restore a sense of possibility, and diplomacy has a chance. Don't restore a sense of possibility, and unfortunately, I'll be talking about more daunting problems in the future. Thanks very much.